Hola, hola, hola. Now, can you hear me now? Yes, you can. Good morning. How are you today? Everybody, thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us this morning in this public forum. My name is Gabriela Frias from CNN en Español, and since we are throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, I was wondering this morning how many of you come from my same region. Can you raise your hands? Hello. Hello. From where? From where? Okay. We're here this morning to talk about a simple subject, delivering a trade agenda for a sustainable future, huh? Yes, that's how complicated it's gonna be. This is a live conversation, so I would love for you to take part in it with your questions. No comments, questions. We're supposed to be moving from ideas to action, so please make your questions short. We have a lot of questions for our panelists. We have a fantastic panel today, and without further ado, we should just start, and let me just start on the opposite side. Clea Casecook, welcome and good morning. You lead the advocacy and policy development for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and that means listening to the private sector, but also having that voice in the context of global negotiations. We've been tasked with the easy homework of talking about an agenda when we are also worried about low growth, high inflation, food prices rising, and a global food crisis that's getting worse. In a couple of hours, we'll have the IMF and new numbers from the IMF in regards to the global food crisis, energy crisis, and we're not even in the winter time. So things are not going to get easier in the next couple of months. So my question to you is, how has the trade agenda changed for you and the work you do in the private sector in the past 2 years, so we can understand where we'll be coming from?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. And I was thinking about your question as you were stating it. The past years, as you said, the past 2 years have been, they're not unprecedented, I wouldn't say that, but really the crises have come from all sides. The pandemic, COVID-19, and to be honest, we are still reeling from it, the war in the Ukraine, the climate crisis, and we see its impact right now. I often mention it as the 3 Cs, COVID, climate, conflict. There's so much going on. I think one of the things is for companies, and at WBCSD we work with over 200 companies, some of the largest multilateral companies in the world around sustainable development and fighting climate change. We have identified the importance of working together pre-competitively and also working much faster, radically, engaging with stakeholders that we traditionally might not have had to do. What we have really focused on in our work around, if we look at trade, is more around moving from supply chains to value chains and looking at how can value chains be transformed to improve nature, to support people, and also to address the climate crisis, while at the same time, obviously, being part of a business model. We have looked at that, and I can go into more detail in the work that we did around the Stockholm Action Agenda, where we focused around key value chains, such as around mobility, food and agriculture. We also looked at, for example, travel and tourism, which is kind of a nascent area to focus on, and that key enablers that need to be focused on, such as radical collaboration, accountability and transparency, governance and infrastructure. I can go on and on and on, but just for me to end, companies, businesses know that they need to work together radically, also with others, to address some of these issues right now. We don't have time to wait.
We would love to understand, and just so that you can think of your answer, how to better describe what radical collaboration means, what's different when you talk about radical collaboration, and thank you. Prason Kumar, hello, good morning to you. You are the CEO and the co-founder of Billion Bricks. Your task, your passion, is to solve the climate and housing crisis through functional housing solutions. And house affordability is increasing, and it's a big problem all over the world. What has changed for you, for the good and the bad, in the last 2 years?
So I'll probably start with good first. And I mean, we work with communities across Asia, which are generally very, very poor, and trying to provide for housing solutions for them. And the thing with poor communities is that they are so disadvantaged most of the time that a crisis like COVID doesn't do much difference. So there was definitely a shock period where people had to kind of adjust to what's going on. They kind of lost their jobs and livelihood, but they came back very, very fast as well, being more entrepreneurial and empowered themselves, especially if you look around tourism industry, how people lost their jobs, but they slowly went back to agriculture, back to hometowns, and hit back pretty fast. And generally, when I go to and speak to people, say, in developed markets or in New York, they would be saying, oh, the situation's so bad, the economy is going down. But when you go and speak to poor people, you find them always smiling, happy, how bad things can go. So I find that there's a contrast, and we have an image that things are going really bad, but I think for people at the bottom of the pyramid, generally their delta is fairly minuscule for them to really feel it. On the more negative side, what I feel is that as now the cost of money is going up, and as we look at providing access to homes, there's a growing fear that the interest rates will go up on the mortgages, and not only for mortgages, but even for us to raise capital and build houses, which would have a longer term impact in terms of the housing we would provide, and could we really go down to the bottom as we were originally planning to do. So again, the impact is more, I think, from the financial markets as opposed to from the people side on what impact we would see in near future.
Thank you. And you should listen to his TED Talk and the part where you say, why haven't we been able to solve the climate crisis when we've solved other things? When you talk about the Apple, iPod, etc. Very interesting and challenging questions. Now moving to Josefa Saco, very nice to have you here this morning. You're the Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Development, African Union Commission. And you're also an advisor of Minister of Agriculture and on issues of international cooperation. You're from Angola. And in a way, I was thinking which countries resemble in Latin America, the situation of Angola, when you talk about commodities and oil dependency, informal economy, and the challenges that we have ahead. What has happened in the last 2 years when we're also talking about this complicated context of very high food prices and fertilizer prices?
Thank you, moderator. Good morning, everyone.
Your microphone.
Present. I acknowledge the presence of Director General, my sister, Dr. Ngozi. Thank you for inviting me to share some experience. I just want to say that I'm also Commissioner of the Environment, Sustainable Environment, not Development, just to correct it. And I will talk more about what I'm doing now as a Commissioner for African Union, And, you know, being Africa, as we all are aware, that we are not emitters of, greenhouse gas in the continent. Our responsibility is just 3%, but we are concerned about it. And that's why this panel is very important for us to look further into the nexus of trade and environment. So to look at trade and environment for the past 2 years with the COVID-19 pandemic, we say that we saw a lot of disruption in food supply chain during this period, mostly since 2020, during the COVID pandemic. And Africa, our characteristics, unfortunately, with all the potential we have, not to import food. We are net importer. Mm-hmm. On the continent, we have 35 countries that are net importer of foods. So we really need WTO to be very close to us so that we can, do our trade very clearly and not polluting. When we look at the responsibility of these international import and export trades, it's very high. It's 20 to 30% of GHG emissions, globally, where transport alone accounts to 12%. And that is where we have to tackle, because we are on the way forward to Sharm el-Sheikh, and we really need to come with lesson learned and good solutions, because we are really assisting what climate change is doing globally, and mostly in Africa, where we are more vulnerable to the effect of climate change. That is why we really need to innovate and bring new technology, new energy. We are talking about energy and fossils, to use fossil. We in Africa, we are concerned about energy transition, but we want just transition. We cannot move from one energy today, tomorrow, because it requires a lot of investment. Those are the type of conversation we have to have with the developed country, and really make advocacy that we in Africa, we want to go through clean energy so that we can reduce all these emissions. So that is one of the concern and priority for Africa. We have our own strategy on climate change, a strategy for resilience and development action plan. And this is where we want to start, implementing so that we can reduce emission, I think.
Thank you. Professor Landry-Signé, welcome. And you've talked about tapping that potential of Africa, and probably linking to what the other continents have done, Latin America, for example, the lessons learned from our region that can be applied into Africa. But first, the risk of derailing the implementation of an agenda for Africa in the context of the Ukraine war and what has happened in the past 2 years. What would you say?
Thank you very much for the question, for having me to express my perspective. Let me start perhaps with a quote from Dr. Konji Iweala. I think yesterday she mentioned that the future of trade is digital, is green, and is inclusive. So thank you, Dr. Ngozi, I think, for your extraordinary leadership. The world needs more leaders like you in addressing challenges related to multilateralism. And let me start with some important trends and showing how and why it is so important to connect trade and environmental sustainability and sustainable development, even from a strictly business perspective. By 2030, adopting proper trade measure and environmental measure can generate, by a Global Commission report, more than $26 trillion of product benefits. Can create more than 65 million of low carbon jobs. Can also prevent the premature death of more than 700,000 people, like young kids. So those numbers are extremely important. And when we even push further and we look at the financial implication, one of the reports which was released by the Thunderbird School of Global Management assessed to $1 to $3 trillion per year the potential of financial revenue created just by aligning trade and climate transformation, which include adaptation, but which also include the various other measures. So to conclude there, we have the broader benefit. I mentioned the financial benefits, but the broader benefit could be from 3 to 5 trillion per year. Now, speaking about Africa, Africa generates less than 3% of the emissions globally for 17% of the population, and we have about 80% of the people who are the most affected by the climate crisis, who are African globally. So this is a serious challenge, and this requires climate justice among other factors. And we speak now about the pandemic, we speak also about the Ukraine-Russian war, but even before the pandemic, more than 130 million people around the world were displaced due to economic consequences of climate change. So I want to say that the conversation that we are having now is simply a critical one, and no institution but the World Trade Organization is equipped to really make a difference worldwide in terms of bridging trade and sustainability.
Thank you, Professor. Pamela Hamilton, welcome. You're the Executive Director of International Trade Center, and I think in the past days, you've highlighted the tools that are available and that are making a difference for SMEs. What has happened in the past 2 years in terms of new opportunities, the world realizing, these companies realizing that those are the tools to transition, and the challenges that you've seen so far?
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and thanks, Dr. Konjewela, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Let me just first of all say that there's always a tension between trade and the environment. Mm-hmm. And that's been part of the challenge. That the tension is not just because trade contributes to environmental degradation, but also the tension that trade can actually help to fix the problem. And so how do we move from one perspective to the other? It's not a zero-sum game. Mm. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is how do you ensure that trade enables faster access to the lowest cost goods and services? That's one of the main issues. The second issue is how do you enable adaptation to decarbonize? How do we actually help countries make that move? Because the truth is there's a cost. And there's always a cost with making any change. How do we enable that change to take place? So trade has a really critical role to play, and the WTO is central to that role. And I think Dr. Ngozi has already clearly established that this is so. And so we're preaching to the choir here. The issue is how do you use the trade rules to speed up the dissemination and enable the carbon transition? Also, how do you ensure that while trade does contribute to challenges, it can also be part of the solution to the problem? So we need collaborative thinking. As our colleague said, radical collaboration. I'm really interested in that. Radical is my word. So, but also removing silos. There has tended to be a huge divide between trade and the environment. The trade people talk to the trade people, the environment people talk to the environment people, and never the twain shall meet. We need to fix that, and I think Dr. Ngozi is already on it. So I am sure there will be a trade and environment meeting soon. And then finally, ensuring an inclusive approach, gender and youth. How are they being impacted? And one of the things that we've been working on in terms of tools is the climate smart agriculture, also looking at helping businesses to go green and what are the transition points necessary to do that, and ensuring that trade is part of the solution.
Thank you, Pamela. Just to go ahead, you were going to say, to sum things up, I would like to share with you a question that was recorded from in this public forum. This is John Lee, so if you can please put on your headphones so you can listen to the question. And this is pretty much highlighting the radical part of our conversation. Ready?
I am John, CEO of Bottlesop. The question I'd like to ask is, COVID-19 and the pandemic demonstrated our ability as a globe to radically transform our lives in a very short order of time. What can we take in terms of radical actions to drive positive movement towards addressing climate change that are radical change to the way we lead our lives? Thank you.
Okay. And the radical, who wants to start? And this is steps.
I mean, I can speak on this. I think radical is definitely the word of the day, and but from my perspective, I see that there's a lot of focus on climate change. I'm hearing decarbonization and the impact it's having on people. But what this is doing is that there are certain problems that we haven't solved for the last 20, 30, 50 years of housing, water, food, and they are getting sidelined. There are more people in the world today that die because of not access to housing, of just living in cold climate areas, because of refugee conditions. And we are talking about something, decarbonization, which is going to impact we rich people maybe 50 years, 60 years down the line. So in my opinion, if we want to take a radical approach, the approach should be that for maybe the next decade, let's just focus on problems that we have not solved in the past, solve them first, make sure people have access to basic human rights of housing, food, clothing, water, and then think about things which will impact us in the future. I think the problems in the world are just too complex for us to solve at one go. And that's where we find this disconnect that you're talking about between trade and sustainability, because it's just very, very difficult to align all the interests, all the stakeholders together. And I'm speaking this from a position where I have to deal with not only people who are very poor, but I have to deal with governments, I have to deal with financiers, I have to deal with regulators, and trying to align them to develop one project that we are trying to do in the Philippines, which has just about 1,300 homes, is taking us more than 5-6 years to develop. So when we talk about radical collaboration, we need to think about speed, and we need to think about what is the primary problem that we are trying to address, and not get digressed with all the chaos that exists in the world.
Thank you. Yes. Claire and then the Professor Sanjay, go ahead.
Thank you. I was listening to the question, and actually I do think we need to address this with a lot of humility, but we need to learn, especially from the pandemic. Because if we look at what happened there, we did have a lot of radical collaboration that didn't exist before. We had pharmaceutical companies working with governments, working with universities. I won't go into the specific examples, but I think we can just look at the various vaccines to see what can be done to, it's never before happened in history, to create a vaccine that fast. Now, not everything went well, and we know there are extreme problems also in the dissemination of the vaccine, especially in Africa and other continents. So I'm not saying it all went well, but there are a lot of lessons we can learn about how collaboration can work very fast. And how can this be applied to, for example, the climate crisis and the WTO? That is something we could look at, and I looked at the WTO, and as I was preparing for this, and it plays such a key role to really be the driver and force of a global rules-based trading system. And companies are seeing the need for more action, faster, but also predictability. Doesn't sound that exciting, but predictability is key, especially if you work in markets like the ones right now.
Yes.
And the WTO has done interesting work a lot lately, such as about advancing technologies and looking how can duties be lowered and trade barriers be addressed, for example, around technology transfer, especially technologies that can help address the climate crisis. So I think we need to learn what has worked and what didn't, and see how can we apply it to some of the issues we're facing right now around, for example, trade and the environment. That would be an interesting model. Obviously, it also means looking at diverse stakeholders, building trust, creating a safe environment for dialogue and action, and also looking at the incentives that need to be put in place. Because incentives are key, and I need to highlight that.
Thank you. Andre.
Thank you very much. I will highlight a key dimension with the World Economic Forum. I led the capacity building effort of the Global Future Council on Agile Governance. And there, Agile Governance tried to address a couple of challenges. The pacing challenge. To what extent policymakers could react timely to the emerging issues, whether disruptive natural catastrophes or the war in Ukraine, for example, the Russian-Ukraine war. And the second dimension is the coordination challenge. So we have a broad variety of players, of actors, governmental, non-governmental, civil society, various industries, among other. And the goal with agile governance is to really bridge the gap between the fast innovation of the industries, but also the imperative for government to adopt, to be flexible, to be nimble, and to ultimately configure the economy so that the citizens are ultimately served. So I think that we have to, in agile governance, to really foster that radical collaboration.
Sure, thanks. I think for me, one of the fundamentals of radical collaboration, of any kind of radical action, is the issue of fear and trust. It's fundamental. The fear factor and the trust factor are critical in addressing this problem. The fear factor that many developing countries have is that this is a Western agenda that is being pushed at their expense. The trust factor has to be therefore enabled through convening powers of organizations like the WTO, like others, joining together and providing that space where this discussion can take place. That is what leads to radical collaboration. Because if you think about it, the other issue is that if the fear factor also with respect to COVID, people have to realize that climate change is killing us. That literally we're dying. We're just dying, not dying as quickly as COVID. So I think people also need to recognize what the impact is going to be if we do not act and act quickly. It may take a little longer, but the point is we're dying. The planet is dying.
Now, when you talk about trust, there's a lack of trust, and it's decreasing in government and institutions. In Latin America, for example, it's an important example. And with the intention or the intent to do fragmented solutions within countries, communities, countries, regions, the question is how can the private sector, the academia, the NGOs work around rebuilding or radically changing the way we trust our institutions. And I think that's also important because we're talking about building an agenda and having a voice where we're supposed to be a call to action to everybody, just changing from consumer patterns to production patterns, etc. Who likes to start? Oh, please.
Thank you. I think from COVID example, stage in 2020, we have to change the narrative. Mostly us in Africa. Lesson learned from the COVID pandemic is that we cannot longer be dependent on other external markets. We saw it, during the COVID pandemic with rice. When we wanted to import rice, our traditional market in Asia, where they banned the export. So this is really an opportunity for us in Africa to change the narrative and really untap the potential we have, to depend on our own intra-African trade. That is what African Union is really, going through as a priority. Because we saw that we wanted to import several goods and food, even medicine, we couldn't. So this COVID brings us really an advantage for us to have a new paradigm of doing things. Like you say, we need to engage everybody, the stakeholder, private sector. Africa, we are much dependent on public, the government and public institution, instead of us to really build up on exports, private sector. When we look at Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine crisis, it's very important for us because today we have a shortage of cereals. Mostly the northern part of Africa, they depend on export from these two countries. And with this crisis, those are the type of, homework that we have to do at home and start building. And with this, we have a good lesson, a good example with the African Development Bank and African Union. We put ourselves together and we say, what is the solution to respond to the Russia and Ukraine crisis or conflict? So we came out with a facility with the ADB. We came out with African Emergency Food Production Facility. And the ADB puts $1.5 billion for us to produce cereals on 4 crops, which is rice, maize, soybeans, and wheat. And we know that by next year, a country like Ethiopia will be exporting wheat. So those are the good lessons that we need to take our responsibility on the continent. We also, with the World Bank, we also managed to solve the problem of the Horn of Africa, which we are going to have a big conference on the 10th of October about solutions, because we don't want just coming here and start talking to the press. We have to bring, what we are doing. So we need solutions and action, action, action. Thank you.
It feels like without trust, no agenda can be implemented fully, because you won't have everybody going along with it. So I think we should add that. I just want to make sure that I am aware of questions in the room. Please raise your hand if you're ready to ask questions, just to make sure how many I have ready. Okay. Is there anybody else who wants to talk about building trust so that we can work on that agenda?
So, related to the question of trust, I think we have different dimensions. For example, with the African Continental Free Trade Area, there are various dimensions to further increase the connection between trade and sustainability, but also sustainable development. When African countries trade with one another, more than 40% of the products which are traded are produced locally, so which means they have implication for job creation among other. And when African countries trade with the rest of the world, it's only about 17%. In my most recent book, some of the I estimate to about 16 trillion US dollar the combined consumer and business spending. So this means that we have a unique opportunity to really make a difference. Now, how could this happen? How to build that trust between the industry, for example, and the public sector? At the continental level, you have various tools. So one, especially in the context of the AFCFTA, is to have provisions which will facilitate the trade in green products and services. So that is extremely important. So that's one dimension. So removing the barrier, for example, for trading goods and services. So a second point is to also have provisions which could, let's say, prevent the further development of environmentally harmful products and services. So the idea could be to create a better level playing field when we compare industries which are developing products which are green versus the other industries. And finally, we can also enable country to have a policy space to protect areas when environmental concern could evolve. So I think those are some concrete measures which could be developed by country or at the continental level, and that is not just in Africa, also in other parts of the world. The European Union, for example, has been very active in developing those type of measures.
Mechanism and data, and the sharing of that data is important, correct? Go ahead.
To the point on data, Anna, it's key to highlight the importance of transparency and then accountability.
Yes.
So, and that is something on the transparency, the integrating reporting frameworks to also help companies identify risks, but also report on them will be key work, and we're working with ISSB and a few others to drive this kind of work forward. But I would just again stress the importance, if we want to build trust, we don't just need transparency and alignment about what actually needs to be reported, but ultimately also accountability. accountability from all stakeholders, and how do we actually measure and review progress, and how are stakeholders being held accountable, including the private sector?
Pretty much talking about radical leadership to change those patterns. That's what we're talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
For me, trust is also a grassroots issue.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, if the small businesses, for example, the ones we work with, which are 90% of international trade, if they don't trust that their governments are actually putting in place the mechanisms to allow them to make this shift in a way that also keeps them alive, that enables them to survive. And this is one of the things we're working with at the 3 levels: the BSO level, the business support organizations, the governmental level, and at the SME level. It is a confluence of trust that needs to take place at all 3 levels, so that it enables businesses and communities to make the transition, but also to survive and to thrive. And that is one of the key elements in enabling trust and in enabling a just transition.
Yeah, and to make a virtual circle, let consumers know that this is working. Otherwise, we won't be completing that circle. I believe there was a gentleman who had a question, so let's move to the floor for a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for this insightful speech from the panelists with regards to delivering a sustainable, with regards to trade agenda towards a sustainable development. So my question is, when you look at the financing of most trade and the institution that form most of the world institution, most of the African countries were not there when the institutions were formed, like the GATT and equally some of World Bank, IMF. So to the African Union representative, Jaffa, what are we doing to develop a financing system whereby most of our trade will be conducted within that framework? And what are we doing so that most of our international trade will be of something of sustenance? Because when you look at the borrowing from IMF and the World Bank, the digits given to African countries and other countries are different. So what are we doing to develop that financing capacity to give us that space to be able to build up?
Thank you.
Thank you for this important question. At the African Union Commission, there is a decision of head of states to have a bank, to reinforce the African Development Bank to focus more on these issues. And we also have now the IFCFTA, who will play a core role on this trading in Africa. So I think we are really coming there, and we have those 2 structures that we really need to reinforce their mandate, so that through our own Africa, made in Africa, institution, we can also, have this type of smooth trading regulation standards on our continent and policy as well, and to help our member states to take advantage, mostly this private sector. I'm really concerned about the SMEs, private sector, informal to be formal, because in Africa, most of our trade is informal, and mostly with women, because we have to look at women play a very important role on the informal. And in Angola, there was a question the moderator asked me what we're doing. Before I went to Addis Ababa to work, we are trying to really see how can this informal becomes a formal, so that women can benefit and we can empower women on trade as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's important also to, I'm wondering now if financial institutions are also radically thinking, acting different, considering the sense of urgency that we're all instilling here. Professor Lander, what would you say?
So, during UNGA, so we have many side meeting, including with Afemzim Bank. And I think one of the new mandate of the bank is not just to support the African continental free trade area, and among other is to create a new a greener Africa, which is aligned also with Agenda 2063. So for African countries, trade is really a tool for industrial and for sustainable development. So I think the bank are thinking about it. They are developing new tools, including on the continent. But what is needed is more resources globally, new, let's say, financial mechanism, because you mentioned what the African countries are doing, yes, whether at the sub-regional or at the continental level, but it is quite complex to match the level of global financial resources. And I think that is where it's extremely important for our partners in Africa to drive and develop new tools and provide new resources for the continent.
Thanks. On the issue of financing, there's no question that this is going to be also where the rubber meets the road. Because for adaptation issues, the issue of financial access is frankly the biggest thing for many, particularly small island developing states like where I'm from, which are literally either sinking or being washed away depending on the season. I just got a WhatsApp at 3 o'clock this morning from a friend who has just indicated that Barbados will be the first country to draw down on special drawing rights for climate adaptation as of in the next month from the IMF.
Yes.
Which is very interesting. It is a complete paradigm shift for the IMF to begin to look at this. So it shows that there is change. There is a willingness to be open to new ways of thinking. And I think more and more financing institutions need to begin to recognize that this will be important in any transition to address the climate change challenges.
We have a number of questions that I just, there's one, I'm going to just use one of the questions that was recorded yesterday because I want to get into those examples of islands, climate change specifically. But before that, there's a student from Mexico who recorded a question that I'd like to pose to you. So if you can just put your headphones on and listen to it. Thank you.
Dear panel, I just wanted to know, what is the role that the WTO can play in order to attract sustainability issues since its members seem to try and avoid enforceability on that subject?
I see a smile there. Clear. Thank you. Thank you, Sergio.
Should I start?
Yeah, sure.
So, that's what was funny. I was thinking, really, so how, basically, to paraphrase the question, how can the WTO basically make sustainability issues more attractive to the member states to really push that they actually happen so that there is some concrete action linked to them? I mean, ultimately, and I think this links to Dr. Koch-Hamilton's points earlier, it links to both the issues of the risks and the rewards. Absolutely. We see some it's not about future risk. We see the risks now. We see the impact on small island states, but we see it around the world. We see it in Pakistan, which was a lot in the news, but we see it really around the world. I don't need to go into more examples. The other one is around rewards, which links to my earlier point about incentives.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be just practical, like people often think a reward means a financial incentive, but it doesn't have to be per se. It could be long-term quality of doing business, let's say speaking from a business perspective. Issues around improved trade agreements, things like this. I think we have to think very creatively and kind of maybe get rid of some of the old ways of approaching some of these issues, but think about it through the practical. I think countries know that something has to happen because they see the risk issue. I think what needs to be clarified a little bit more is most likely the possible rewards or incentives for actually tackling some of these issues, especially for emerging economies. That's something, because I think in a lot of the developed markets, they already are seeing it, and they're also quite clear about the benefits and the incentives, and I think they're getting consumer pressure. A few days ago, we had a discussion around the importance and the rising voice of consumers, especially youth, etc. So they're seeing that. But I think we need to clarify that a little bit in other places? It's a simple answer to a very good, complex question, but I had to think through this fast.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, it's a great question, but I think in a way it's a little, well, young people are allowed to ask unfair questions, right? Of us old people, like, it's not, you guys are doing nothing. I get it from my son every day, so I know. I think it's a nuanced issue, and the fact is that there have been major movements since 32 years ago when I was here during the Uruguay round, when environment was raised and it was literally thrown out. There was going to be no discussion. There was no willingness to address it. There is a willingness to address it now. The fact that there was actually a fish subsidies agreement, in June, suggests that there is movement. There's also the fact that, there's the TSSD, the discussion on environmental sustained structured discussions, and also the informal dialogue on plastics and pollution. There is a willingness to begin to address these issues in the context of, trade and trade agreements. I think it's just the how and how far do you push and how much can you get, the risk and reward issue. I also think that it's important in these discussions to enable capacity building, particularly for the developing countries who are now being asked to take on additional obligations without the clarity of what it is going to mean for them internally. And I think that's important.
We have another question on the floor, please. If you can just tell us who you are and then your question, thank you.
Okay, it seems fair. Soma Rosa. I'm the head of corporate affairs LATAM for Unilever, based in São Paulo. And thank you for a very inspiring and informative panel. I keep thinking about incentives, how much multinational companies can play a role here to support SMEs to transit to a low-carbon economy and also to thrive, having them, evolving and not killing them. And how much of that it's important also in the ESG agenda, how finance gets regulated and how those, environment and social behavior are rewarded in the businesses.
Thank you. And I just want to say, after COVID-19, SMEs were so challenged and tested, and it's important to understand their importance for the world economy. Yes, Claire, you want to answer a question? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's our bread and butter,
Yes.
SMEs, so
Yes.
I'm happy to hear that question. One of the things that we did very quickly after COVID was last year we did our SME competitiveness outlook on greening, the green transition, especially greening businesses. And the point we made was, how do you encourage businesses, SMEs, to see this as a business opportunity as opposed to something that is going to destroy them? So what we did is we came up with a kind of 20-point proposal, 20-point action plan. And what we showed the SMEs is there is a benefit because, one, it lowers lowers your costs. Your productivity costs go down. Two, it increases your access to new forms of financing, which is always an issue. Three, it also increases your competitiveness because it allows you to be able to look at organic markets, increases your price point and allows you to engage in that way. It also increases your productivity levels even at that. And so what we have to do is to make the business case to SMEs that this is also in their interest. Because the cost of making the transition, particularly upfront payments, can be huge. The second issue we looked at was the government issue. What does government put in place to make this possible? Now, many of the tariffs, for example, in the Caribbean are low for environmental goods and services. The problem is when they get to the border, it's a completely different issue. There are all these various, technical barriers to trade, various measures that eventually make it difficult. And so one of the things I was saying this morning early at the breakfast was, the changes that have been made for the importation of electric vehicles in Barbados. that have actually lowered the cost almost by 50%, removing all VAT. And it has increased the importation of electric vehicles for such a small island, changing the carbon emissions completely. The second thing is to make photovoltaic a right for every household, which essentially means you do not have to request any permission to put that in place. So these are the kinds of tweaks and steps that need to be taken at the governmental level, SME level, and also at the support level to enable this to happen. Access to finance, they were looking at the special drawing rights, but also on a green bank and green bank financing through the CDB. So there are various measures that need to be taken at all levels, but it's happening. And I think those are the kinds of things that are important.
Sounds so
Can
easy. Yes, please, go ahead.
As you can see, I'm struggling a little bit here to be part of the conversation because each time you guys talk about policy issues, I think about what I see on the ground.
Yes.
And I want to make two comments, one on
Yes.
you, and I think you talked about the incentives, right? And you talked about the photovoltaics as well. So we work in the solar industry, right? And for the longest time, a lot of the countries we worked in had an incentive to promote solar cells, right? And that did great work. A lot of solar farms were built, or rooftop solar was provided for. And you could actually see a lot of countries claiming that a substantial percentage of the energy production is moving to renewable sources such as solar, which is a good move. While this is going on in parallel, there's a second industry which is developing called crypto, which comes in, and now you have to mine these bitcoins. And the amount of energy it uses, if you take statistically, and I'm not a statistician, I don't have the numbers, but if you look at the total bitcoins, I'm pretty sure it has taken a lot of that progress that we made away. So we built communities which have about 10 megawatts of capacity. 10,000 bitcoins is all it takes to mine all the energy that we produce per annum from that one single community. So we can keep talking about incentives, but there's a parallel world out there which is totally different and negates every progress that we make all the time. The second I want to make, and I'm not familiar with Unilever that much, but I'll give you an example, that there's a huge conversation around plastics, bottled drinks that we have and plastics, and we need to control that. And when I meet a lot of professionals in conferences like this from companies that do a lot of plastic, they always talk about how they're working and incentivizing their teams to reduce this plastic, and they're working on new technologies, bottles, and creating incentives to do it. But the same people are not aware of their own sales team that is required to produce results from quarter to quarter, where the sales number needs to go up. So we work in Philippines, and I was very impressed with a company that makes a lot of sugary drinks, that they talked about reducing plastic. And I go to Philippines about 2.5 years ago, and I see that they flooded the market with these small bottles that cost 10 pesos, which now have more plastic per milliliter of that sugary water than what existed in the bigger bottles that were coming. And this is totally hidden from the rest of the world because no one goes to those Philippines towns. That's not part of the conversations in the Western world. And it keeps creating this negative impact, which we are unseen of, and we don't even talk about those things.
Unless we see a video on CNN of all these bottles, going into the shoreline. Yeah, exactly.
And we see it for a few days and we forget and we move on.
Exactly.
Right? So
what do you suggest?
Sorry?
What do you suggest?
Oh. That's the difficult part, right?
Yeah, but it's going back to the drawing board and becoming radical.
Yeah,
We're
so I
talking
think-
about being radical. We need to show examples.
I'll make 3 suggestions on this, right? First is that I think we have to start learning and really carrying forward on our values and moral trainings and doing the right thing. Today, we keep our personal values, personal morals away from our morals of the corporations. So we believe that we need to save the environment, but if our company that we work for damages the environment, we are okay, because we put the onus on the company and not ourselves. But at the end of the day, all companies are built by human beings. So I think there's this detachment that we've got between our values and those company values. The second is that I think we have to stop talking and doing more on the ground. So all the people, in my opinion, who are in academics and policies, they need to spend at least 6 months on the ground, really seeing what happens. Like in this conversation, I'm hearing so many people talking about how do we bring in more investments into, say, Africa, for example.
Yes.
But this is the wrong forum. There are no investors here. You need to go to the right forum and talk for bringing in investments into Africa at the right forum. So, and the third is that we oftentimes keep the business interest and the developed interest totally different. So to give you an example, I can go and build a business which is for profit, and I don't have to care a darn about the externalities that it may have on environment and on social impact, right? I build a business where my goal is to provide affordable, net zero housing to the poorest of the poor, and the amount of responsibility and onus that's put on me on the quality of housing I have to provide is tremendous. So people want to make sure that our housing is built with bamboo, sustainable materials, uses low energy, low conservation of water, and we forget that we ourselves don't live in that lifestyle. But for the poor, we want that perfect solution. And so many people, I mean, I've got a booth here, come to me and ask me, what materials are you using for your housing? But that's totally irrelevant, because the goal of the organization is to provide housing to the poorest of the poor in the shortest amount of time. And you see how many people stop by our booth, which is fraction of what people are here. And I look at on the other side, Meta comes in yesterday with a virtual reality thing, and people are lining up on that virtual reality thing, which I don't know is what creation will that do to the world. And people are not even asking questions on sustainability of the materials of their ocular glasses and stuff. That's not even part of the conversation. They've got access to billions of dollars to build a metaverse in which people will do something which we don't know. And we have to struggle to provide housing to people, which is a human right. So I think these three things we have to address in an urgent basis, and we have to start empathizing with our lifestyle. What we want is no different from the people that want on the other side.
Thank you. I think those are extremely important points. But I also think that it is not either or, for example. Why is it important to also speak about financing here? Because there is no trade without investment. And in order to unlock investment, we need good trade policy. We need a conducive environment, among others. So I think those dimensions is a nexus, which is really important. On the question related to the role of multinationals, for example, Microsoft has committed to remove the level of carbon emitted since its creation. So that's one of the dimensions. Plus has created a fund to finance some of the carbon removal activities, among other. When I last checked, was $1 billion fund. So, of course, much more may be needed globally. And the third point that I also want to make here is related to what some of us call at the Brookings Institution, Africa Alternative Path to Development. Usually traditional manufacturing, when considering traditional manufacturing, many people or scholars have stated that Africa is deindustrializing. However, when we look at industries without smokestacks, which are greener industries on the continent, and we call them industry without smokestacks, they are ICT related, they are associated with agri-industry, with horticulture, ICT services, among other. Exports in those industries have grown 6 times faster than export in traditional manufacturing. And to connect with SMEs, the majority of key players are the SMEs on the continent, small farm holders as well, who in sub-Saharan Africa represent 60% of the activities. So again, when we have the conversation, we tend to sometimes, and that's why radical is a good word, but it's also a dangerous word, because who hear radical, some people hear radical, think about exclusion, where the goal that we want to bring is instead inclusion. How can we, if you associate to radical inclusion, I think it will be easier to have conversation with a broad variety of stakeholders, because this is a multi-stakeholder effort. Thank you.
But I also think that there are a number of questions. I have a lot of questions, and we only have 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to ask a number of questions. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that to so many people out there, this is a parallel universe, period. period. And this is why we need to talk about an agenda, which is the homework for you before we leave. Three things we are to do to have that trade agenda for a sustainable future. The to-do list is what we're going to finish this conversation with. But we need to acknowledge that for a lot of people, social entrepreneurs, women, there's a parallel universe that's just not relatable to what we're having, what we're talking here. Can you please raise your hands again so that I can see you? Brief in your questions, please, so that I can give the opportunity to most people. Please, can you start? Thank you. Please tell us who you are and your question.
Thanks so much. I'm Jorge Armijo from Trade Tank MX, a Mexican think tank focused on trade. And of course, climate change is very important, but I was thinking on sustainable trade for future probably pass through focus on worker agenda, of worker-centric agenda. So I just want to ask how labor market approach can be addressed from sustainable trade perspective, and if this is part of the solution. I mean, thinking on the social focus of the trade agenda. Thanks so much.
I'm going to add the two more questions, and then I'm going to allow you panelists to answer the question. Can you please, yes, over there, yes, please. Hello.
Good morning. Thank you so much to the panel for your insightful presentations. I'm Emmanuel Wachenda from the Institute of Economic Affairs, Kenya, a think tank. And my question is around priorities for trade. So here we're talking about sustainable trade. Mm-hmm. Now, my question is there an allowance, is there room for different priorities for different regions of the world based on their actual resource capacities? Mm-hmm. So where some countries, we just look honestly at their budgets and say, you guys, maybe you can't afford to make this kind of transition just yet, so maybe you should prioritize, say, industrialization, yes, and then think about the other priorities later on. Now, this, I'm not saying that we should destroy the environment, because even where I live personally, I've seen the economic benefits of having a place to work, but then factories that are unregulated, how they destroy the environment. And so can we have priorities? I mean, yes. In conclusion, for example, during COVID, we saw that with vaccine shortages, there was actually prioritization. And so, I would not want to, I'm not trying to say that policies should have entitlement embedded within them, but just saying that, okay, let's have this realistic realism reflected all around and say, if we're going to prioritize vaccines, why don't we also prioritize our climate or environment objectives?
I think we get your point. The third question I'm letting our panelists answer, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning and happy Thursday, panelists. My name is Jonathan Serrano and I'm a student from Ecuador. For example, I was very intrigued by the discussion we had about trust. It's positive to see all the advances made here in Geneva.
Your question?
But there is a vast majority of the population who doesn't have an understanding about trade, about economics. And at the end, they are the ones to select the new governments who will send the new representatives to these organizations. Therefore, my question is, to move together to a future, what's a role and activities the WTO should take to strengthen its relationship with the people?
Very important too. Please, Claire.
Just a few key points on the questions that were raised. First of all, any kind of transition, and this came up earlier, needs to be just. So the world of the just transition. And I do think, regardless of what we talk about, when we talk about the climate agenda or the trade agenda, equity needs to be at the core of it. So I wanted to highlight the equity part. The other one was about prioritization. I think that's a great point. We see it in our everyday jobs. We need to prioritize and focus. And ultimately what can help there is taking a systems lens, almost encouraging cross-ministerial collaboration on a government level, but also on how do you prioritize, for example, on the trade and environment agenda. There are so many public institutions that have great expertise in that area. Can they work together to develop concrete action plans for particular countries or regions? That is the other part. And then on what the WTO can do, I think many things the WTO does is already great. The public forum, and I've been here a few times, the small clips, the video, the social media campaigns, but I think making trade real for people. Not talking about abstract numbers, but using particular case studies, examples from the developing world, but not only from there, and why trade is so important. Almost like looking at history and stories from what happened thousands of years ago, where trade existed, to where it's now. I think that makes trade real and very personal. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Let me start with the last question. You know, for the WTO to engage at the community level is hard. But what they do through organizations like the International Trade Center is actually to work with small businesses on the ground in the communities to make that translation, I call it, from trade rules to actual trade happening. And so that's a very, very specific way that the WTO has been able to work through us and with us to enable countries and communities to understand what trade is about and what it means for them. So the translation takes place. On the second question, you know, in terms of prioritization, one of the biggest challenges that I think most organizations or financing institutions face in terms of prioritizing for climate change, financing, etc., is how do you prioritize between Pakistan and Fiji? You know, how do you prioritize between a country that's sinking and one that's being washed away, and you know, 1/3 of the place is underwater? It's almost an, you know, a Faustian bargain. How do you do that?
Yes.
So I think there is a recognition that there needs to be focus on particularly vulnerable countries like those in the small island developing states that basically face existential crises. But then at the same time, there's a recognition that there are catastrophes all over affecting billions of lives. So it's something that, you know, we have to be patient with. And on the labor market approach, the kind of human-centric issue, we've been working with ILO through our Trade for Sustainable Development program on a social and labor convergence indicators and program, which literally looks at the impact on labor and on social issues. So we are working on that. We're trying to see how we can actually address it in a more wholesome way, and we will be continuing to work with the ILO on addressing that issue. Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay. 2 minutes only left for this conversation. I know. And there are so many questions that I didn't ask you from the public, plus my own. But I don't want to leave this panel without giving you the opportunity of organizing our minds, our brains, with that list. If we were to deliver a trade agenda for a sustainable future, what do we need to do in the next 6 months, 12 months? You take a pick. But it's so important that we leave with practical solutions. Who wants to start? Everyone has a shot at this, so please.
I can start.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I think my take is that I think if you want to build a trade agenda which is more sustainable, it's actually, I think the point you made about being driven by people, right? So we have to look at our own lifestyle, our own consumption patterns. And the moment we do that, and we maybe reduce our consumption or we move to more sustainable things that we want to buy, that automatically will change the world and start influencing how the trade becomes more sustainable. And I was just reading some statistics yesterday that Amazon's got about 12 million products that it sells, but only about 20,000 of them are sustainable material products. And I keep hearing that the Gen Z is asking for more and more things which are sustainable, but the growth in unsustainable things is far greater than in the sustainable products. And I want to correct my statistics. It's not 20,000, it's 200,000. So it's still 0.16% of all the products that get sold. So we have to change ourselves, and the rest would change on its own.
Thank you, Professor. And of course, the role of the WTO here in your answers. Claire?
A few things come to mind, and they're kind of maybe not that connected, but somehow. One is, and that came up already because I'm thinking really the next 1 to 2 years, is collaboration with it from the WTO and others. Fast collaboration, and it's already happening. And you mentioned the ITC and ILO example, but I think showing the willingness of organizations to collaborate, even though if previously there might not have been. I think that's one, to also address issues. For example, WTO and WHO are working together on the health agenda. I think that is going to be a key area. The other one is going to be showing some successes and celebrating them. For example, around the fisheries space, celebrating successes and making sure people know. And the other one, and that's a little bit more, maybe a bit more long-term, but it came up at the breakfast discussion. I've been thinking about it, and it's also a key priority from a business perspective, is the area around reskilling and the jobs for the future. And we discussed we need more accountants who can work on sustainability. We need the skills. It's more long-term. That is more for the long-term, but it's so core and vital to trade. Yes. So something I wanted to highlight.
Thank you.
Thank you. My takeaway from these discussions is, first of all, concerning the WTO, what's their role? I think they should align their rules. The WTO should help member states to align their rules, the WTO, the trade rules, with the climate change goal. That is number one. Number two, collaboration. We in African Union, we say leave no one behind. Even the UN slogan, we say leave no one behind. What we feel in terms of collaboration, we African Union are not even observer here. So what is our role? So we need really an observer status here, because Africa is a big place where trade is happening. Africa is where the future is. So I think we need it, because we have the biggest, youngest population on the region. So we really need to be here and guide our African group as an African Union umbrella of this organization. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we need a few things. First and foremost, multilateralism. So it's extremely important to engage in multi-stakeholder in the renewed multilateralism, which include different voices. So that's one dimension. A second dimension is to bridge the gap between the policies and the implementation outcome. Even of the policies which already exist, we often have a gap between what we are supposed to do, whether at the national, at the continental, or at the global level. So bridging that gap with the existing policies could be transformational. So the third dimension, and align also with what I say, is the role that the WTO is playing. So I think that we mentioned trust. Member states should better trust the WTO, because I think there's no other organization which can really help bridging trade and sustainability like the WTO. And I finish by mentioning something which was said, and I think I will say part of it at the beginning by Dr. Ngozi. It's that the world needs new rules, because the future of trade is digital, is green, and is inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you. Pamela, how would you finish?
Thanks. I agree, ditto to everything else that's been said. But I think there are three main things I would say if we're talking about immediate action. One, we need to convene at the policy level between the WTO and the organizations that deal with climate and environment. There needs to be a convening of the ministers of trade, ministers of environment, and whoever else in between. Have that meeting, start that dialogue of trust, and begin that cross-fertilization of ideas. Yeah. The second is financing for adaptation. We have got to have a mechanism by which countries can access the finance needed to begin the change process. It's easy to talk about change and what needs to be done and policies, but if there's no money, countries have to do what they have to do. And then the third issue is building the capacity of the SMEs to make these transitions as well. Because the capacity, as you say, skills, etc., are a major issue. If we're shifting, it's kind of like when I grew up, my son saw something in a antique store one day, and he asked me, "What's that, Mom?" And I'm looking around, and I'm trying to think, what would he not know? He was 12 at the time. And it was a typewriter. He had never seen a typewriter. And the point I'm making is that the world has shifted so dramatically in the last 20 years that we also have to change the skill sets that we're giving to people in the context of climate change.
I want to thank you, the extra time, the extra minutes that you stayed and remain here. I just want to leave with the importance of these public forums, because we also need to be, this needs to be contagious, and thinking different. And the Director General said 2 days ago, we cannot afford to do business as usual, and that means also taking part in the conversation. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for ideas. Have a good day.